Tom Eble, a good friend from over in nearby Columbus, Mississippi at WCBI-TV, CBS affiliate there. He covers the Bulldogs on a daily basis, and he joins us now to talk some MSU football. Good morning, Tom. How are you?
Good morning, Gary. How are you?
Doing great. Appreciate you coming on. Let's start, and there's a lot of things I want to cover here, but let's just start with Joe Moorhead because, and Tom, you may disagree with me. I thought he did an okay job last year, but I thought, honestly, that team that he had, because I saw that defense up close against Alabama, with that kind of defense, with a senior quarterback who had done a lot of positive things, he may not have been the greatest passer in the league, but he certainly was an accomplished quarterback. They had a powerful offensive line, good running back. I thought that team underachieved a little bit. I'm just going to be honest with you. And I wondered, as I know a lot of Mississippi State fans did, that if Dan Mullen had been there to coach that team, would they have contended for an SEC championship against Alabama? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think, first and foremost, I think the expectations were placed insanely high because of all the talent that were on that team. But I think one of the biggest things, and it's been talked about even this offseason with head coach Joe Moorhead, is the offense didn't work the way he wanted it to work. You know, ideally, in a Joe Moorhead system, the quarterback's going to rush the ball 10, 15 times max a ball game. Of course, with Nick Fitzgerald, they rushed with Fitzgerald more than 200 times all year long, which was an insanely high number for a Joe Moorhead system. But I think when you look back on it, it's going to be one of those state teams that you go, man, how did they go 8-4 just because of the amount of talent that came off of that team? But I think with Joe Moorhead, this year, I think is the year we'll be able to see what really happens, just because I think Mississippi State's offense is much deeper this year than it was last year. I just think last year, with the struggles in the pass game, you just had teams putting 8-9 guys in the box almost every single time, and they weren't able to open it up. And so I think the expectations were placed a little high because I think everyone saw what Joe Moorhead had done at Penn State, and they thought they were going to get the exact same thing. But I think it's going to be getting more of Joe Moorhead's guys in the building. Of course, Dan Mullen, you can look in hindsight. I think they probably could have been a better team if Dan Mullen was there last year. But a lot of those guys that were on the roster were still Dan Mullen guys. They're guys that were recruited by Mullen and his staff, and they were taught Dan Mullen's system. And as we saw what happened with Florida, it's a system that's very predicated to what kind of talent you have in certain positions. And so I think expectations-wise, it was a little high, but I think it's unfair to write off Joe Moorhead after 1 year. But I do think it's going to be one of those seasons where you go, man, how did you not win 10 ball games with that roster?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not anti-Moorhead either. I think he is a good coach, but I'm also in total agreement that I watched the bowl game, for instance, and give Iowa credit. But it was clear to anybody, I think, that watched that game that Mississippi State was much more talented. And that was kind of, to me, very symbolic of the season. I mean, they should have won that game, and they found a way to lose it. And you're right, though. I think as talented as Nick Fitzgerald was, I don't think it was a good fit. I remember against Auburn, basically, they just said, listen, we're going to run the ball. And they were able to beat Auburn doing that. But, passing-wise, it just didn't seem to work the way Moorhead would have liked. And now that leads me to my next question. This time last year, we thought that Mississippi State would be grooming Keaton Thompson to be the starter after Fitzgerald, but Tommy Stevens transfers in from Penn State, where he had worked with Moorhead. He may be the type of quarterback that Moorhead is more comfortable with. Where do you think this quarterback battle stands, and is Stevens, in your opinion, the front runner?
If you were to ask me who's going to be the day one starter, I would pick Tommy Stevens, just because, we've talked about it even with Tommy so far this offseason, fall camp and things like that leading up to week one. He's been familiar with Joe Moorhead's system now. It'll be 2-3 years. Obviously, the terminology has changed between Penn State and Mississippi State, but the concepts are almost exactly the same. And so Tommy feels very comfortable with where he's at. But I do believe the quarterback competition is much closer than what you would expect. So ideally, Joe Moorhead had said that he was hoping to have a day one starter named 8 days from game day. We're closing in on that, and from every single time Joe Moorhead has talked about the QB competition, I believe it's much closer than what people think, even though Tommy Stevens is looked at as the front runner. Because if Keaton's able to take that next step as a passer, those two have been up the top. I mean, it's going to come down between those two. They both showed the ability to run the ball and run the ball well, which is a big thing in a Joe Moorhead system. I just think it's tough with, Tommy Stevens as a senior grad transfer, as a guy who spent time with Joe Moorhead at Penn State. He's familiar with the system already. It'll be, I think it's much closer at this point in time than what people think, but if you were to tell me who's going to be day one, it's Tommy Stevens, because he is very much that quarterback that Joe Moorhead is looking for to lead a system like this.
We know this, regardless of who is taking the snaps, they're going to have a great back to hand it off to in Kylan Hill, and a good back behind him in Nick Gibson. So, and Mississippi State seems to always have a big physical offensive line. I know they're moving a couple of guys around there, but that should really be a big plus to have a guy like Kylan Hill, who, if he played, let's be honest, if he played at Alabama or LSU or Georgia, would probably be more well-known because he's a tremendous player.
Absolutely. And I think the toughest thing about Kylan is, people aren't, they say, what did he do last year? Obviously he's looked at one of the top backs in the SEC West, and you can make the case for the SEC in general. But last year, with the disparity between Nick Fitzgerald rushing the ball 200-plus times, Kylan still averaged 6.3 yards a clip last year. So he's a fantastic football player. He's shown he can hurt you in the pass game as well. And I agree. The interesting thing about Mississippi State, though, if you're looking at Kylan Hill, is I think the big thing for Kylan this year is the talent at wide receiver. I think that's been one of the biggest position groups that's been talked up so far during fall camp is, the guys in the wide receiver room. Javante Payton was a JUCO transfer, stood out so far in fall camp. Stephen Gindry looks to have taken the next step. Gedrick Thomas coming back for another year. Those are just some guys. And in the tight end room as well. You're going to have guys that are going to be able to open up the field for Kylan. Like I mentioned it earlier. Last year they were facing 8 or 9 guys in a box almost every single snap. And you mentioned the Auburn game, and that was what they expected. That's what you expected with Mississippi State. They were going to run the ball 30-plus times to try and have the defense win a ball game, keep the game tight, take time off the clock. But this year, I think, is going to be a little bit different because of the talent that's on the outside. And so with those pieces coming together, I really think year 3 is the year that Kylan Hill will explode onto the scene. I know he had some games last year. The Kansas State game stands out at the top where he rushed for 200 yards in a ball game. But I think this is going to be a year where people start to recognize the talent of Kylan Hill more fully than what it has been in the past. But I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of the talent that's going to be on the perimeter as well.
Talking Mississippi State football with Tom Eble, sports director at WCBI in Columbus. Defensively, last year that was an elite defense. I think Bob Shoop's a tremendous coordinator. I think Mississippi State led the country in yards per play allowed. But you lose 3 first-round draft picks, and that's a lot of talent. I know there's some good guys coming back. Will there be a drop-off on the defensive side of the ball, in your opinion?
Yes. And you alluded to it. Losing 3 first-round talent, especially 2 guys from that defensive line, it's really hard to replace that. And it's really hard to expect a guy, let's say, obviously defensive line is one of the big competitions going on right now in camp, and especially at defensive tackle. Defensive end, you still have Chauncey Rivers coming back, a talented guy who came from EMCC, originally started at Georgia. Now he's here at Mississippi State. He's a guy that played a lot of meaningful minutes last year, so he's really the guy to keep an eye on for their defensive line. But I think the toughest part is going to be replacing having a guy like Jeffrey Simmons in the middle, the amount of attention Jeffrey demanded inside, and then having a guy like Montez Sweat rushing the passer. That kind of production is really hard to replace. But Bob Shoop talked about this at Media Day this past Saturday. Is they're going to remain the same. They're going to have the same kind of mindset, same kind of defending. Maybe the blitz calls will change up a little bit, but they're still going to have that same kind of defensive style. Like you mentioned, that they weren't going to change up too much, even though they're losing guys like Jeffrey Simmons, Montez Sweat up front. But I think the bread and butter for Mississippi State year defensively is going to be their linebacking group, led by Errol Thompson and Willie Gay. Those are two probably some of the best linebackers in the SEC, in my opinion. In terms of Errol as a quarterback, he can stop the run, defend the pass, and then Willie Gay is probably one of the top coverage linebackers, I think, in the SEC. So that's going to be your bread and butter. They're going to be young on the back end, even though they're going to have Cam Dantzler, who Pro Football Focus named, he gave up the lowest passer rating in the SEC last year. So you could leave Cam on an island, but there's going to be some young guys on the back end as well. And then, of course, replacing a guy like Jonathan Abram is going to be difficult too. But Mississippi State feels very strongly about its safety group, mainly Brian Cole, who played a lot last year until he got hurt. And so he fits that Jonathan Abram mold as a guy that you can play one safety high or bring him up in the box to defend the run. So I think there's going to be obvious drop-off because of how good they were last year. I believe they only gave up 12 touchdowns all last season. And so that kind of production is one of those that comes once in a lifetime. But, they're not going to drop off as far as I think people believe they will.
Wrapping up with Tom Eble, our Mississippi State preview. Of course, the Bulldogs blitzed the Ole Miss Rebels in Oxford last year in the Egg Bowl, 35-3. Brawl in that game. What's been the fallout from that? I mean, this was not just your typical, little dust up. This was a big old brouhaha. What's been the fallout, and what will we see this year in the Egg Bowl in Starkville as a result of what happened last year?
I really don't think much. The fallout, obviously, Commissioner Greg Sankey, they've met up with the ADs. Obviously, I was Ross Bjork at the time, who's now at Texas A&M. I just, the way I look at it is it's Egg Bowl football. It's just two guys got in a scuffle, and then it was a blowout at that point. I believe it was 27-3, or it was the final of 35-3 at that point. So, it just tempers run high in that game. And a lot of these guys, they grew up together, but it's almost like that brotherly love. It's like they grew up on the same team. They played each other in high school. So it's just that, when tempers flare, that's just, it's Egg Bowl football. It's rivalry football. I don't really believe fallout is going to be much this year because it's two completely different teams. They've been, both athletic administrators have talked about, dying down a little bit, laying back on some of the hostility. But I think that's what makes, obviously you don't want brawls, but I think it's what makes college football fun is the rivalries like that. And you keep it not as hostile as that, but still have fun with it. But I think with the Egg Bowl this year, it seems like whatever you expect is going to happen, it's probably not going to happen. So it's really a toss-up ball game at the end of the year every year.
Finally, Tom, and we're running out of time, but two members of that Mississippi State coaching staff last year moved about 90 miles down the road here to Tuscaloosa in Charles Huff, the running backs coach now here at Alabama, and Brian Baker, the defensive line coach. That's the coaching business. We know that. But what was the vibe in Starkville to lose two coaches, not just to any school, but to an SEC rival that geographically, Mississippi State and Alabama are closer in terms of miles than any two campuses in the conference?
The vibe off the bat is obviously disappointment because, Alabama they have been the SEC the past couple of years, for the past decade, really. And so the vibe of, and not just losing them to Alabama, but those were two of Mississippi State's best recruiters. And I'd make the case those are arguably their two top coordinators aside from, Bob Shute. And so it's two tough losses, especially since you had a guy like Brian Baker that developed that defensive line last year. And, Charles Huff, who help develop guys like Kylan Hill and at the time Aris Williams and Nick Gibson. And so the vibe is tough because it's, you lose them to Alabama. It's just kind of, you shake your head and you move on to find the next best, hopefully the next best assistant coach. But I think the biggest impact with those two guys leaving Starkville was the recruiting. And so I think the first thought is, a lot of the talented defensive linemen from Mississippi, well, they might just end up at Alabama now. So it's the unfortunate situation of going, we lost one to Alabama. It's just, you shake your head and kind of move on and hope you find the next best coordinator somewhere.
That's right. All right, great stuff, Tom. We appreciate it. Hey, folks, if you want to follow the Mississippi State Bulldogs, you can follow Tom on Twitter at Tom_Eble. And I know a lot of people that listen to us on the radio show there in Pickens County and places in West Alabama are able to watch WCBI and keep up with their local newscast on television. Thank you so much, Tom.